This is Greg Canty here, and welcome to the Win Happy podcast. Stay tuned for interesting chats with interesting people about winning their lives and being happy at the same time. This show has been brought to you by Fusion Communications. Thanks for listening. In part one of a two-part podcast, I chat with Eoin Kernan, founder of Discover SUP, about his OCD and eating disorder, which led to a full breakdown in 2019. Eoin found his own secretive ways of coping with his mental illness, until eventually it came to a breaking point. We spoke about the pressures of modern life, workplace and personal expectations, and what can happen without an appropriate pressure valve. Eoin speaks candidly about his mental illness and his long road to recovery, and the special role of art therapy as part of this. Let's hear from Eoin. Eoin Kernan, a huge welcome to the Win Happy podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, yeah. I'm happy, and we're starting to see the grand old stretch, and things are warming up a little bit out there. So yeah, I'm good.
I was thinking about you before we hit record, and there's a lot of colours to you, and you're involved in a lot of different things. And if I asked you this simple question, if I met you in the pub, I'd say, yeah, and what do you do? What would you say to me?
Oh, that's a loaded question, given that you've nailed me to the mast as having many colours. What do I do? I'm myself, and I've learned that that's the simplest answer to that question, and the answer that I feel most comfortable to give. I suppose in years gone by, I would have tried to answer that question by saying all sorts of wonderful and grand things, whereas I've slowly but surely begun to find the comfort in just being myself and being Eoin Kernan. And yes, I do a number of different things which give me joy and hopefully give other people joy. But at the end of the day, I'm just waking up, I'm living my day as Eoin Kernan and going to sleep as Eoin Kernan. So maybe that's a slightly skewed way to answer that question, but it's, I suppose, the way that sets me up with least expectation.
Yeah. But isn't that what we do? And isn't that expectation around those things, that we're supposed to be something, and that something should be a credible thing or a good thing or something that makes us feel good about ourselves? Or back to your word about expectation, that it meets someone's expectation in the best possible. And even if we have a number of variations to that question and how you might describe your role or your passion or whatever that is, invariably there's a bit of pressure to present the best part of it, the part that makes you look good, and they'll think, oh my God, isn't Eoin doing well for himself now? Isn't he leading a very interesting life? There is that little bit of a pressure, isn't there, on all of us?
Absolutely. Living your best life is a phrase you hear quite a lot nowadays. And are you living your best life? And, it's tough to match up to that and to deliver on that, because what is your best life, and what is, your best life according to someone else? At the end of the day, if you wake up and get through your day and go back to bed and go to sleep and survive the day, in today's world, you've probably done quite well, given the multitude of things that you'll encounter during the day. Some that are very intense, some that are, dangerous, some that are simple. Even crossing the road nowadays, get across the road and don't get knocked down. That's an achievement. So, I would say that certainly we are kind of encouraged to try and deliver and achieve and be successful based on the world, of social media, based on the world of high flying business, based on the world of, athleticism and sport, and, based on the world of, the visual image and how we look compared to others. Whereas, in reality, I think we would all live much happier lives if we were able to remove a lot of that. Now, will that be removed? No, because it's what sells, it's what makes money, it's what marketeers do day in, day out, because they have business clients that need to sell products. And we see that even nowadays in the world of wellness, in the world of mental health, where a lot of the therapeutic interventions that would have been around for many, many, many years are now being dressed up in these kind of commodified ways, where you pay your €10, you go down to the beach and you do your bit of yoga in the full moon. There's nothing wrong with that, but where people are starting to make that only accessible if you have money, I think that's wrong. So I think we need to maybe come back to just having slightly simpler lives, if possible, where we're kinder to each other and remove a lot of the expectation we put on each other.
Yeah. At the beginning of this year, I've addressed a few topics, and one of the first conversations I had was with a guy called Andrew G. Marshall. He has a podcast called The Meaningful Life, and he does a lot of counseling, I guess you'd call it, in particular around your close relationships, that relationship with your other half, your partner, your boyfriend, your girlfriend, whatever that looks like. And I thought that was interesting because, the context of a new year, we think about our New Year's resolutions and, it's work success, or maybe I'll go on this dream holiday, or, I might save at that house. And a lot of the time we ignore that thing at the core, which is, that close relationship you have with other people. And if that's going well, your life tends to be a little bit better. You're whistling, going out the door of the house every day, and your general mood is a little bit better with everyone you interact with, etc. The second conversation I had was with a guy called Paul Dean. He's a professor in UCC, and that was about your relationship with the environment, the things around you, your electric cars and the food that you eat and how you heat your house and all that kind of good stuff. And I thought with you, Eoin, we might have a little chat about that relationship that we have with ourselves, outside of everyone else, and maybe have a little bit of a think about that during the course of our conversation. And of course, the listener now at this point in time is saying, who is this guy Eoin that Greg is chatting to? That allows us to have this conversation. What experience does he have? And they're probably thinking that you're a counselor or a therapist or something like that. But and I know that's not the case, but you do have a lot of experience in that area. So I asked you, what did you do? And you kind of bounced around the topic and just said, I'm me and I'm happy with that. But what I would like to do is bring the listener up to speed as to who you are and why we're having this kind of conversation and the experiences you've had along the way. So a very, very simple question. Eoin Kernan, who the hell are you and where did you come from?
Well, I was born in Cork, but I don't really admit that. I then had many different places around Ireland that I grew up in. My dad moved around because of work, so I lived in Castlebar for a while. Limerick is probably where I was born and bred, if people ask me. I lived there for about 20 years. But then what I feel is I came home to Dublin. My family are all from Dublin, and I happened to move back to Dublin about 12 years ago now. And very coincidentally moved back to the old homestead. So I live within 5 minutes of my grandparents nowadays, which is a lovely thing. And particularly over COVID, I've been able to spend a lot of time with them, which was precious and wonderful. I'm 40 years of age, recently turned 40, and was full of trepidation before it, but thankfully it's passed over relatively quietly and easily. And I'm kind of going, what the hell was all that? What was I worrying about as such? So yeah, that's been the most recent milestone, I suppose, in my life. But I suppose you mentioned there about that idea of people listening to me maybe thinking, am I a counsellor or a therapist, or where do I come with this knowledge of the mind or the way we live in the world? And that comes very simply because I have lived and living experience of mental illness. and that in 2019, I basically developed severe mental illness, an eating disorder, OCD, depression, and generalized anxiety disorder, and had quite an acute mental breakdown, which to this day I'm still working through the therapeutic side of that. And I suppose, people might say, oh God, poor Eoin, or that's awful, or, really sorry to hear that, or whatever. But one of the things that I look back at, these past 4 years and think is that it's actually been a huge privilege in a way to have had to deal with this, because up until that point, up until late 2018, early 2019, when I was about 36, I was living what I thought was the model life. I was working towards a good career. I was working towards trying to buy a house. I was very happily in a relationship with my partner, Carolina. We didn't have kids. That was maybe on the horizon, and we were starting to hear that from external sources, from my parents, from the world around us, and from other friends and colleagues of ours. And little did I know that within all of that model life that we were living, all of these external pressures, career, house, family, success around, finance, or the number in your bank account or your pay packet, all of that was creating a huge amount of pressure in my head, huge amount of pressure in my body that I didn't realize. Like the old pressure cooker that we used to have on the hob at home, building, but I didn't have a valve to let it off. I didn't have a valve to let off that steam. So what happened was, as a result, a little bit like the analogy I use is when you have an allergy. So you take something in, your body reacts to it, and it produces a rash. In my case, what it produced was an allergy to this world. What that produced was an eating disorder. What it produced was hyper OCD. I'd actually lived with OCD all my life, kind of without realizing it totally, but it became hyper. It developed into depression. All I wanted to do was hide away from the world, and also developed really, really severe anxiety, proper generalized anxiety disorder, where I could not function without having a severe degree of worry and panic. And that brought me to a point where I became suicidal. It's like I fell off a cliff in 2019. A lot of people I've discovered, they tend to, sometimes their mental health challenges tend to develop over a long, slow burn. For me, it was very quick. For me, I was, quite calm and quite calm and grounded in the world at one point, late 2018. By the middle of 2019, I was suicidal. It was very, very quick for me. And I found that quite confusing. I found that quite distressing, because I'm quite a logical person. Quite a sensible guy, I think, with maybe not the most wonderful academic mind, but certainly I think a pretty good street mind. I'm street smart, I'm socially smart, let's say. But I couldn't understand this, and I remember one particular time in 2019. I just suffered a panic attack related to food, because a lot of my eating disorder behaviors had become quite ingrained at that point. And I'm sitting there on the couch after this attack, and I'm in floods of tears. At age 36, my mother's on the couch beside me. My mother really helped me a lot through many of these different episodes. But all I'm doing is shouting out, I'm so effing confused. I'm so effing confused, because I could not make sense of what was going on. So what happened then was, over a period of time where things continued to get worse, and I found myself in hospital, and then found myself in residential treatment for these challenges that I was living with, or these what became diagnosed illnesses. The reason I come back to the idea of it being a privilege was I was given a chance to press pause on my life. I was given a chance to go, hang on a second, Eoin, why are you not happy? Why has this rash appeared that, there's an allergy going on in your body or in your mind somewhere? We're going to give you a chance to work this out. We're going to give you a chance to figure out what's going on. We're going to give you a chance to do that without expectation. You'll just go in, and all we want you to do is be better. And this is what I'm hearing from my parents and from my partner. We don't care about anything else. We just want you to be well. And there's not many people that get that in today's world. In today's world, you are constantly supposed to be on your game all the time, delivering all the time. Every day is meant to be as good as the previous day. You can't stop. because if you stop, you fail. If you stop, you don't keep moving forward. Whereas for me, I stopped, and I can tell you 4 years later, I'm now in a much better place than I would have been if I hadn't stopped in 2019.
Okay. The young Eoin growing up, your mum and dad, what do they do?
My dad has worked in pharmaceuticals and chemical engineering for all his life, and that's been his role. And as a result, moved around a lot of the big multinationals that were in Ireland, I suppose, around the 80s, 90s, and still to this day. My mum was a teacher, and then gave up teaching to parent myself and my 3 sisters, and then went back to teaching, and has just recently retired. So, it was a pretty standard household. 2 loving parents in a very happy marriage, myself and 3 sisters who all got on. There wasn't anything other than the normal, the normal arguments over small, simple things, but nothing unusual.
Yeah. Were you a happy kid growing up?
I thought I was, but I think in recent years, through talking about my childhood and talking about different things, I'm not going to say I wasn't a happy child, but I think there was things that did get to me that maybe I didn't or wasn't able to vocalize, or, that maybe I was actually kind of oblivious to as well. I was certainly kind of in school, I was probably the softer child, the more sensitive child. I've always been more sensitive. I find it hard to shirk things. I find it hard to forget about things, or also I find it very hard when I see someone else in distress, or someone else, that might be upset, or the last thing I want to do is upset someone. So I think certainly through my teenage life, and into my, early 20s, and right up until nearly I got sick, I was a yes man. I was very much always saying yes, just because I didn't want to disappoint anyone else. But the OCD, as I mentioned, that's been there all my life. I did have that as a behavior since very, very young.
Yeah. And in terms of, your college life or your education, rolling on to your first job and the jobs after that, what path did that take?
I was never, as I mentioned, I was never massively academic. I didn't really enjoy the academic side of things. So I did a leaving cert reasonably well, I suppose. It came, it fell in around the 50% mark or something. I can't remember how many points it was. It did mean that I just scraped into the course that I wanted, not even that I wanted, but that I had applied for in college. Whether it was, I can't even remember whether it was what I wanted or not, but it was the one I had applied for. College wasn't for me. I dropped out of college very quickly and actually went working straight away then. Found myself in a job that I academically wasn't qualified for, but even to that point, through my work experience, was certainly qualified for. I was in a marketing position for a sports centre down in Limerick. And the reason I found myself in that position was because that was where I got my first part-time job about 6 years previous. So even though I didn't have the academic qualifications, they said, well, Owen, you've worked here for long enough. You know how this place works and what we want to do. So we're going to put you into that position. So that was where I found myself in the world of work then.
Yeah. And you've always been quite active, haven't you? I know you're very close to the sea. So was that an outlet for you throughout all of that time, or has it become an outlet since?
It's become more of an outlet now, in that I now use it for my well-being. But I suppose around that time, particularly in Limerick is not a watery city. It is not. In fact, it turned its back on the river for many, many, many years. It's only in recent times that it's probably reversed that and come back to look at, what the water can give it. So when I lived there, I didn't really find that I had a massive aquatic, life. I was a competitive swimmer for many years, but that was in a chlorinated swimming pool, which was not very nice. I'm much more attracted to, being in the salty water along the coastline. So no, there was a period of my life there where I suppose being close to water paused for a while. But then when I came back to Dublin, that did reappear again.
Yeah. And obviously you covered a lot of ground up to when you were 36. You've got the marketing job. I'm sure there was a pressure there to deliver results and everything else, all that goes with it.
There absolutely was. There was that's what, unfortunately, I think what marketing brings is it brings targets and it brings expectation. And as I said, I hate letting people down. I hate annoying people. And, when you're working in a marketing job, you're very open to that.
Yeah. And it's funny, with us in Fusion, the thing I kind of say to all of our team is that instead of one person worrying about a big number, you have to bring this into, well, it's a responsibility for the business that it washes its face. And it's like playing a soccer match. You need to tell everyone where the goalposts are. So, and if you don't aim for something, you can end up just drifting. It can be very motivational with some people, obviously. That's with Fusion. And before that, I've had other roles. I was a general manager in drinks companies and all that kind of thing. And you'd have a target. The business has a target. And you give your distribution manager a target. And the sales guys have a target. And the manufacturing guys. And a lot of these are just to make sure that the ship is steered in the right direction. And if everybody takes that responsibility for their little part, well, then hopefully the ship comes in. But of course, it is a world of targets. And, with us in Fusion, we've got a team, a fantastic team, mixed ages. I guess anything from, young college graduates, maybe 23, 24 to, some people who are a bit more senior. But I do know we've got a responsibility around those. And I keep on saying to them, listen, the targets are a metric. It's just a way of measuring the business, and it's not the only one. And with the best will in the world, some of them will be under pressure with it. And I'm very, very conscious of that. But at the same time, I know that I can't just take them away because from one day to the other, you have no idea where things are going. So you need to keep it there. And it's kind of a reality of life. But you do 100% need to make sure that the same target to one person, it can be a motivator, and to someone else it could be something that would crush them. And I guess listening to you, Eoin, you could easily have been, one of our team members and popping in every day and say, oh my God, I've got a responsibility here to bring in this number. And if I don't, I'm going to let everyone down. And I hate to think that a simple metric that we're using to kind of keep the business and good business practice was crushing one of your team members. How do you make sure that doesn't happen?
It becomes something that I will potentially trip up over. That's what I would feel. And I think, to answer your question, there's two things you can do, or two things I would have loved to have happened for me back then. One would have been for my managers at the time to ask me what my values were. Ask me what was it that drove me, because money doesn't drive me. I realize I need money in order to pay my bills and keep a roof over my head. I get that. I'm not stupid. But I have no desire to be a multimillionaire. I have no desire to, to see, shares building in a company or anything like that. That's not what drives me. So as such, it didn't drive me in those marketing positions either. What drove me was building relationships with people, building long-standing conversations and long-standing relationships with clients and customers, which maybe by proxy would bring in more revenue as a result. But that wasn't what was driving me. So, if my managers had maybe recognized that in me at the time, then the simplest thing that would have given me joy would be to go into, let's say, a review meeting, a weekly or a monthly or whatever review meeting, and say, well, Eoin, okay, let's not start on the figures. Let's start on how many of our clients, you've retained, or how many of our clients have said to me, do you know what, Owen's doing a really good job because he knows he's always on the phone to us and he's keeping us happy, or we had a wonderful conversation with him the other day and he's just a really good guy. So it's great that you have him on your books, or it's great that he's working for you. He's a very good representative for you. Then maybe look at the figures. But when the figures were always the first and foremost thing, then that was the fear, was if that goes wrong, it's very hard to make up for that with other stuff. Whereas if you're doing well if you're doing well, matching your own values, then the figures thing becomes an easier thing to deal with, So that's what I would say, is certainly try to understand your employees' values outside of their role in terms of targets or whatever it might be.
Because again, I'm trying to picture myself in your shoes, and you've got that job that you punch in and out of. You've got your targets. You would have managed through a recession as well.
I did. I managed in hospitality through a recession.
Yeah. No, that was tough going. I remember coming back from the States. We happened to be in New York that day when the plane came down on the Hudson. Remember, Sully landed that plane, and think it was just about when the wheels were well and truly falling off in Ireland. We got our plane into Shannon, picked up a newspaper, and one of our hotel clients, the first thing I read was they were going into receivership. So that meant, one, they weren't going to pay you what they owed you, and two, that bit of work that they were giving us on a regular basis was going to disappear. And I think for the next 3 months there was, oh my God almighty, it was like a domino effect. One after the other were cancelling, and we'd just taken a lease on a premises, and you had a team of people and you felt responsible for them in particular. And then, of course, that recession in Ireland, remember, it was the austerity budgets where USC came in and everything else. Mm-hmm. People were under pressure. The business was under pressure. It was a killer time. So it wasn't an ordinary situation either. And I remember having this feeling that you needed to have your foot rammed on the accelerator all of the time. And you couldn't take a breather. You couldn't take anything for granted. And the minute you relaxed for a second, something was going to go wrong. So you were doing well to survive it. That feeling of being up against the ropes stayed with me certainly for a long time. So I'm kind of guessing you were in a similar spot, and that was chewing away at you, and you were obviously doing your best to keep going, but it didn't come without a lot of pressure. That's for sure.
It didn't, and I found myself, funnily enough, in the middle of that recession, I found myself moving out of a marketing role. So this was in another company, moving out of a marketing role into an operations marketing role. So taking on some additional work, and it was nearly like a poisoned chalice when I look back on it now, because at the time, so it was for a city centre bar nightclub type scenario, and everyone was minding their euros. Everyone was, everyone's wallets were closed around that time, and yet I was being asked and expected of to make this venue work and make it profitable and get people through the doors and all that kind of thing. It was never going to work. It really wasn't. And at the time, I didn't see that. But when I look back at it now, I realize it wasn't. But I think the thing that really hurts about that was that I got made redundant from that role. I wasn't given the choice to leave. It wasn't my choice to move on from that. I was made redundant from what I now see as being a poison chalice. And that's it's kind of hard to deal with. I was made to feel a little bit like it was my fault, but yet it was never going to work anyway. So, it was kind of not a nice time. I still feel hurt a little bit by that. I have carried that through to a certain degree.
Yeah, I know on our side of things, clients take you on and they're expecting a magic wand. They're expecting everything to transform within a month or two on the back of some activities in a difficult environment. And the team would say it to me. They're saying, Jesus almighty, like Eoin is on again, wondering turnover hasn't doubled as a result of that one little event that you did last week or whatever. And you're trying to explain that it's a slow burn and everything else. And these things take a while to kind of catch on and everything else. At the time, my way of rationalizing it from a client point of view was that he needed what we were doing to work. He needed what Eoin was doing to work. And it wasn't a case of giving you a chance. He actually needed it to happen straight away because they didn't have the wiggle room for it not to work. It became a necessity. And as you said, it was a poison chalice. And it's a funny situation as well, Eoin, because I think when everyone is under pressure, we kind of see a different side to everyone as well, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely.
And you see the good behavior and you see the bad behavior. You see behavior when people are under a lot of pressure, and it can take chunks out of all of us. And I'm just wondering at the time, I think you described yourself as being kind of, a soft kind of character. I'd say exactly the same about myself. Some people might disagree, but but you take things to heart. That redundancy part, you took that to heart. That there's no doubt about it. And you did feel like you'd let someone down or that it was really unfair that someone made you feel that way. It does get to you. And of course, you're trying to get by in your life. Get a mortgage, start a family, go on a nice holiday, and all those things kind of come crushing down around you when that kind of thing happens. And what we're describing is life and things changing for people and the thing going wrong. And maybe some of us are more robust than others, or it can just be a little bit of timing. If a few things happen at the wrong time, then it can rightly turn you upside down. So you mentioned, Owen, that was it 2018, and yet you spoke about having a mental illness. That word, or those words creeping into your head as being a description about how you were feeling, was that the first time that you kind of recognized those words?
Well, I suppose to start off with is I didn't recognize them. So the illness developed without me seeing it to start with. And that's what an eating disorder does. That's what a lot of, those kind of control-based mental illnesses do, is they develop in such a way that the easiest way for me to describe it is my eating disorder became my best friend. It became the only person in the world, and I include my partner to a degree in this, that I could trust, or that I felt I could trust, or that my mind was telling me I could trust. Because everyone else in the world was either putting pressure on me, or telling me to do something, or telling me that I wasn't good enough, or telling me that, I was a failure. I felt like the world's biggest failure. I felt like I had failed at everything I did, and anything that I would take on, even before I took it on, I was automatically feeling like a failure. I was automatically feeling like it wasn't going to work out. So subtly, subconsciously, sneakily, this illness develops because you're basically reaching out to try and grab at anything that you feel like you can control in the world, so that at least you have some degree of safety. It's not a power thing. I've never wanted it to be, wanted to be the almighty powerful person with control over everyone. That's not it. All I'm looking for is something that will just give me a life jacket in this world to keep my head above the water. That's all I was looking for. And the way I felt I was going to do that was by changing who I was. And so I developed what is known as orthorexia to start with, which is clean eating, absolutely knowing the provenance of everything that you put into your mouth, and it's all pure. Everything is pure that you eat. But that very quickly then turned into anorexia. And the reason that did was because the only objective thing in my life was the number on the scales. The only thing that I could believe was real was what that scales was telling me. And what I'd been conditioned to learn through the world was that if that number dropped, I was going to be much better. I was going to be a better person because I was losing weight. We hear this mantra all the time. The diet culture, which is, feeds off people's failure at the end of the day, is lose weight and you'll be a better person. So that's what I ended up doing. But that very quickly became darker. Very, 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 very quickly, for physical and mental reasons. And there's studies out there that people can read about what happens to the body when you starve it. It's a scientific marvel what actually goes on. You would think, you don't eat, so you probably have less energy, so you'll probably sleep more. In fact, you sleep less. You sleep 1 or 2 hours a night rather than 8 hours a night, because your body is constantly on guard. Because if you go back to the caveman era, when there maybe wasn't as much food around, their body was constantly alert, looking for the next meal. So that's what your body is doing when you starve it over a period of time. So I found I wasn't sleeping well. I found I started to hallucinate because the chemical imbalance in my body was starting to change. I was thinking, at one point, I turned around to my partner in the kitchen and I started giving out to her because I thought she'd hit me. My partner would never hit me, but I thought she'd slap me across the head. This was an hallucination I had one day. You have the panic attacks. You start to food hoard. I had so much food in my apartment, but yet I couldn't eat it. And the reason I couldn't eat it was because I knew if I left it there, I was controlling it. Again, I was safe. I had control in the world. So I had come from a world where, for many, many different reasons, I had been affected by external factors that were out of my control. And I needed to find something that gave me safety and gave me control. And that's what it was. I probably always had a little bit of it in my mentality and in my makeup. I mentioned how I've lived with OCD since I was a young child. And my parents would have only kind of really spoken to me about that in recent years. I didn't know that was true, that was actually the case. But I've always had this degree of looking for this safety, looking for this control. And so that's what brought me to the point where I found myself in 2019.
And unusually, you found yourself in a world of needing therapy and recuperation and building yourself back up again. What was that like? Can you explain how did you build yourself back up, and who helped you, and what worked and what didn't work?
It's an incredible world. It is therapy and therapeutic interventions in many different forms is what I've had the privilege of engaging in over the last few years. What it started with was, unfortunately, quite a difficult process at the very beginning, because only I know what's going on up here in my head. And it's very hard to verbalize that. It's very hard when you're in that real distress. It's very, very hard to vocalize that. But you have to try and find help somewhere. Otherwise, as I said, I did. There was one particular night I was suicidal and ended up in a hospital, and that was kind of what started the ball rolling in terms of real intervention at that point. Up until then, I had kind of spoken to one or two different medical professionals who didn't really get it. The first GP I spoke to, when I kind of mentioned, look, I think I've lost a little bit of weight over the last few months. Well, would you eat a few extra nuts and berries for your breakfast? And I kind of, now, when I look back at it now, I think how ridiculous. At the time, it didn't make sense to me, and I didn't see the ridiculousness of it at the time, but now I do. And the same with different psychological therapists that I would have gone and met as well. Again, they didn't really get it. And the most difficult part of all of this was that every time you go in to meet one of these new medical professionals, you have to recount this traumatic story again as to how you have found yourself in this position, and that brings up a huge amount of emotion, brings up a huge amount of, I was floods of tears every time, and you are absolutely drained after each one of these experiences. And then you'd have to go and do it all over again. You'd have to go and it was like torture. It really was like torture, but it was really important to do that, because if I had gone with that first doctor, things wouldn't have worked, because they didn't get it. They may have gotten it for another patient, but for me, they didn't. So what I eventually discovered was two individuals that were recommended to me. One was a dietitian who I spoke to. I always remember Wednesday night, 9 o'clock. She took a call from me, and she spoke to me for about an hour and a half, up to 10:30 at night. I just think the world of her for giving me that time on a Wednesday evening. And she started to make sense in terms of all of these physical and mental symptoms that I was starting to see, and making sense of where they were coming from and explaining it to me. Now, she couldn't tell me what was the trauma behind all of this that had brought me to this point. She could just tell me why I was experiencing these different things. So that was great. That started to give me a little bit of clarity. And then the next person in my life, which I still have in my life to this day, I call her my living angel, is my psychological therapist, my psychotherapist, who I met the day after I found myself in hospital after that really distressing night. I found myself in a room with her the following day in the public mental health system in a centre nearby to where I live. I was nearly mute at this stage. I couldn't talk anymore. I was a shell. I was walking dead, essentially. And I was just sitting in a chair, and I can still to this day hear her voice and hear what she said to me. I couldn't look at her, but I just knew she got it. And she encouraged me. She said, look, Eoin, I think you need to go into residential treatment. I really think you do, because I was kind of hesitant up until then. And she said, I really think you do, and here's why. And because she was able to explain why, and explain why personally to me in terms of my own circumstances, I could start to trust her. And that's what's key in this whole world of therapeutic treatment, is people around you that you can trust. Again, going back to that idea of safety and control. Up until then, the people in my world I felt I couldn't trust, because I thought they all had ulterior motives.
What did she say to you?
She just said to me that I wasn't abnormal. I wasn't unusual. I wasn't strange. What I was dealing with, she could explain to me this idea of safety and control, which I didn't recognize. I just thought that, I was being a bit weird, trying to take control of everything, that it was a bad thing, that it was, that I was doing something wrong. Again, I was being, maybe not a failure, but I was being a bad person in the world, where she was able to explain to me that I wasn't being a bad person. I was looking after myself. I was doing the best I could do for myself in that moment, which was to keep myself alive, by just looking for safety and control. That made so much sense to me, so much sense to me. And so then when she threw out the idea potentially of treatment, and she posed the treatment in terms of not that we're going to take this away from you, but that we're going to help you understand it more. Because that's, again, the most important idea around particularly eating disorder and control-based mental illnesses. You cannot rip the illness away from someone. You cannot rip it off like a Band-Aid. Because if you do, imagine I turned around to you today and I said, Greg, your best friend, the guy you go and you drink pints with every Friday night, or the guy that you go and play golf with on a Sunday morning, or whatever it might be, from this very moment in time, because of what I'm about to say to you, you're not going to be able to see them for the rest of your life. That would really hurt you. That would really scare you. And that's what scares someone when they think about treatment for mental illness, is this thing that's keeping me safe, I can't give it away, so why would I go and get treatment for it? But she was able to explain that to me. Now, look, I'm not going to say it was a revelation and everything was great and I went in singing and dancing into my residential facility, but it just gave me a little bit of comfort that I was going to somewhere safe.
Can you remember that day standing outside the door of that residential place?
I honestly can't, because I was so distressed.
Okay.
I was quite heavily medicated at the time. One of the things that they had to do was to just get me to calm down. They had to give me a lot of medication. And so for the first few days, I don't remember it. But what I do remember, though, was the very first group therapy session I went into. I was kind of hesitant to go into it. I wasn't sure what it was going to be like. Again, I was in a house with a lot of women and young girls, which, funnily, like, a lot of my best friends are female. Again, you go back to maybe the more sensitive side of me connects more with the female world than it does with the male world. I don't like alpha males. I don't feel well or feel good in that world. But I do connect with, the more feminine side of the human race. So you would think I'd have been fine going in there in terms of that. But no, I was nervous. I was a 36-year-old, middle-aged, heterosexual man walking into a house that was potentially full of 18, 19, 20-year-old girls, according to the stereotype. But that first group therapy session that I went into was actually led by a man. And I was invited into it by a girl who happened to be in the house as well, who was 34. And all she said to me, she said, "Oh, just come in and sit. You don't have to talk. You don't have to say anything at all. Just come in and sit." And so I did. And I sat in one of the couches and I wrapped myself up in a blanket and I just listened. And over the course of the next week or two, I started to have this revelation that we were all just in this house dealing with the same problem. Didn't matter, though, whether we had boobs or not. We were all just humans dealing with the same problem and trying to find the answer. We all had different manifestations of it, but we were all just struggling in this world to try and feel safe, to try and feel worthy, to try and feel like we had value. And so what we did in the end was we fed off each other, which was fantastic. And one of the most wonderful things I look back on in that time was there was one particular girl, she was 18, she was quite shy, quite meek, wouldn't speak up a huge amount. But when she did, she had very intelligent things to say. And what she was able to teach me was she was able to explain to me things about the world that I lived in back in that time that I could not make sense of. So the world of social media and why social media was at me so much and why social media was causing me so much problems, I didn't really understand it because I was at the older generation when social media came out, where she really got it and she knew what social media did. So she was able to explain all that to me. And then vice versa. As a 36-year-old, I was able to explain to her things that maybe she struggled with around maybe her parents or around, expectations of careers and things like that, because that's what I knew, I had knowledge of. So it was this lovely kind of symbiotic relationship, of different ages, different genders, all learning together. And that's what this is all about, because if you go back, I mentioned the Stone Age there a while ago, if you go back to that era, we grew up in tribes. We grew up as groups of people, 30, 40, 50 individuals living in really close proximity and learning from each other. And the phrase, it takes a village to raise a child. It really does. But now what we've done is we've gone the complete opposite to that. And we now live in one-bedroom apartments in high-rise blocks in cities around the world. And we maybe don't even get to know our neighbours for 3 or 4 years that we live there. Like I lived in a city centre block in Dublin with Carolina, and for the whole period that we were there, we had an apartment on either side of us, and we knew people lived there, but we never met them. Never met them. So we've been conditioned that we need to have our own place and live our own life and all that kind of thing. Whereas in fact, it's actually nearly better to live in community. And that's what I discovered. So that was, I suppose, the revelation I had. The therapeutic interventions that I had ranged everything from one-on-one therapy through to group therapy, like in terms of talk therapy. But the one that I hold most close to my heart, aside from the one-on-one therapy that I have with my psychotherapist, is art therapy. Like, I can't draw a stick man. Don't ask me. I'm certainly not Pablo Picasso, I can tell you that. But I engaged in art therapy without really knowing what it was. And I now have, those big college folders, the big A1 folders that you see art students walking around with. I now have one of those folders in my wardrobe, and it has maybe 20 or 30 pieces in it. And they are my most treasured possessions because they visualize what was going on in my head in a way that maybe I couldn't talk about at the time. It gave me, the way art therapy worked was sometimes you'd walk into the room and the therapist would give you a theme. Sometimes they wouldn't. You just have a blank sheet. You weren't ever expected to draw anything or paint anything or, create anything. But if you did, you could. Or if you wanted to, you could. And that freedom allowed you to just, nearly in a way, just kind of vomit out your thoughts onto the paper in some shape, color, form, whatever it might be. And then you were encouraged to talk about it afterwards. And that was a real eye-opener for me. I really treasure that little folder of stuff that I have now. And, I have these 2 masks which allow me to describe what it's like, as an individual in the world versus an individual with an eating disorder. And I find them very powerful in a way of describing to people visually who maybe don't quite get it, what it's like, So even for individuals, as a teaching tool, I think art pieces can be very helpful as well. So for me, art therapy was another huge, huge revelation in my treatment journey.
Do you ever open that case and look at some of the early drawings?
I do because I like to, as I said, I'm still in this journey. I still see my therapist, very, very regularly. And I still go back to a lot of the writings and the notes that I do. And I go back to those art pieces because when I look at them 6 months ago, I see something different. When I look at them now, based on the 6 months of learnings I've had in that period of time, I see something different again, or I see something slightly different. Even talking to you now, I hear myself talking about some similar things that I've spoken about before, but maybe in a slightly different way, maybe in a slightly more advanced way or a slightly more mature way. And I don't mean mature in terms of, sensibility or a child versus an adult. I mean mature as in it's developing like a wine would develop, it's maturing with age. And so that's the one thing I've learned in this whole process is that everything is temporary, including your thoughts. Nothing is permanent. I wish I knew that 10 years ago, because if I'd known that everything was temporary back then, I wouldn't have been as worried about what the future was. But unfortunately, I didn't know that. I thought that anything I did was going to affect the rest of my future, absolutely, without choice. And that I could not, it was slightly superstitious. It's actually kind of OCD behavior in a way, and that I would be obsessive about certain things that I would do and how they would affect my future or affect, something 5 minutes down the road. Whereas now I understand the idea that everything is temporary and nothing is permanent. And the most recent time that actually popped into my head was, as I said, I turned 40 recently, and I had a wonderful weekend away with my family and my partner. And coming home that evening, driving back to my house, I was quite sad. And I was going, oh God, that weekend's over. That was really fun. I was looking forward to it. It was great. It's kind of sad. And then I realized, hang on, Owen, okay, that was really happy, but that was temporary. Something crap might come up, but that'll only be temporary. And then you'll have another happy moment, and that'll be temporary. And if you can accept that things will be temporary, including the bad stuff and the good stuff, then you'll always have something to look forward to, or you'll always be more comfortable with what the future might hold.
Yeah, it sounds like slowly but surely, Owen, your mindset is shifting. In part 2, Owen chats about his partner and family and how they coped throughout his illness, as well as the special role they had in his recovery. And also the new venture that he started, Discover SUP, to put smiles on people's faces every day. I hope you can join me on part 2. Thank you for listening to the Win Happy podcast, which has been brought to you by Fusion Communications. If you'd like to get in touch, feel free to send me an email at greg@fusion.ie. So until next time, take it easy.